Caught his maid fixing a $200 million issue in seconds. What the CEO did next shocked everyone. The city outside slumbered in a hush so complete it almost felt sacred, a sprawling metropolis bathed in midnight blue, unaware that everything inside a single penthouse was about to change forever. It was nearly 2 a.m. and Julian Hart, CEO of Hartwell Systems, hadn't slept in over 48 hours. He paced the length of his glass-walled study, the skyline glittering behind him like a silent audience to his frustration. On every surface, his polished walnut desk, the sleek conference table, the towering bookshelves, sat evidence of the crisis that threatened to unravel a decade of work. The flagship software suite, the one pitched to investors as a revolution worth $200 million in future contracts, had crashed so spectacularly that no one on his payroll could explain why. Not the engineers flown in from Berlin, not the consultants billing by the hour, not the freelancers whose fees had nearly doubled in desperation. Every diagnostic returned the same cold verdict: unsolvable. Julian pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes and exhaled. If they didn't restore functionality by the end of the quarter, it wouldn't just be a failed product launch. It would be a public embarrassment, one his competitors were already salivating to exploit. He stalked toward the kitchen, the motion sensors flickering on low lights. He reached for the carafe, intending to pour his fifth cup of black coffee, when a sound drifted from the hallway. Soft, rhythmic tapping. He stilled. No one should have been here. The engineers were gone for the night. His executive assistant had left hours ago. The tapping grew louder, a rapid dance of keystrokes from the study he had just vacated. Julian set the coffee aside and crossed the floor with measured steps, every instinct tight with suspicion. He paused at the threshold. Inside, illuminated by the glow of the massive curved monitor, sat someone he barely recognized at first. She was slight, her hair a tumble of auburn pulled back in a careless twist. Elise, the new maid. She'd started barely 2 weeks ago, a quiet presence who spoke in polite fragments and never lingered in a room longer than necessary. But tonight she wasn't dusting shelves or collecting dishes. She was seated at his desk, typing with a ferocity that belied her delicate frame. "What do you think you're doing?" His voice cracked through the stillness like a whip. Elise jerked upright, her eyes round, hands flying away from the keyboard as though it had burned her. I'm sorry," she stammered, her voice thready. "I know I shouldn't." "You're not supposed to touch that," Julian said, advancing into the room. Though his face was composed, his tone was unmistakable, a dangerous calm that preceded interruption. "I know," Elise whispered, her gaze dropping to the carpet. "I wasn't trying to interfere. I saw something that didn't look right." He ignored her, leaning over the monitor to see what she'd done. His intention was to confirm she'd accidentally made everything worse, to call security if she'd tampered with proprietary code. But as he read the lines she had edited, his breath caught in his throat. The error, the one that had cost them 2 weeks of stalled operations, was gone. Not just patched. Completely restructured, the logic reframed so elegantly he wondered if he was hallucinating from exhaustion. He scanned it again, then a third time. It was perfect. Slowly, he turned to her. "How did you even know what you were looking at?" Elise swallowed. "I studied software architecture. At Stanford," she added quietly. "But I didn't finish." "Why not?" "My father passed away," she said simply. "My family lost everything. I had to work." Julian tried to reconcile the shy housekeeper with the woman who had solved the problem an entire team of PhDs couldn't crack. His mind reeled with possibilities, questions he couldn't yet articulate. Elise shifted, her hands twisting in the hem of her sweater. "I didn't mean to overstep," she said softly. "I'll leave now if you prefer." He didn't speak. He was still staring at the screen. "You rewrote the critical function," he said at last, voice quiet but sharp with awe. "That mistake alone was costing us millions." Elise took a hesitant step back. "I only adjusted a few lines. I wasn't trying to." "You saved this company," he interrupted. Her lips parted, astonished. I did. Yes." He exhaled a shaky laugh. "You did." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken possibilities. "I'm sorry," she began again, but he raised a hand. "Don't apologize," Julian said, his gaze locked on her with a clarity he hadn't felt in months. Not ever. He looked back to the code, the blinking cursor that had once felt like a death knell and now shone like salvation. For the first time in weeks, The tension in his chest eased. "Stay," he said finally, voice steadier than it had any right to be. "There's something I'd like to discuss." And though neither of them knew it yet, this night would become the turning point of both their lives, and the legend everyone at Hartwell Systems would be telling for years to come. The morning sun cut across the penthouse in slender golden stripes, glinting off polished steel and glass. But Julian Hart barely noticed. He had been awake the rest of the night, replaying every detail of Elise's improbable intervention. The impossible fix, done in minutes by a maid no one had thought to notice. Now he stood by the enormous windows, phone pressed to his ear, as the company's CTO, Marcus Bell, droned in disbelief. "You're telling me," Marcus said slowly, voice thick with fatigue and suspicion, "that the person who corrected the core architecture was your maid?" Julian didn't answer right away. His eyes flicked to where Elise sat perched on the edge of the sofa. She looked out of place, a small figure in a borrowed cardigan he'd fetched from the guest closet, hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Her name," Julian said finally, "is Elise." There was a beat of silence. "All right," Marcus said, sounding as though he were trying very hard to be diplomatic, "but we can't just bring her into the process. We don't even know if it was luck." Julian watched Elise watching the floor, her expression guarded but not afraid. She had offered to leave more than once before dawn, but something in him hadn't let her go. "It wasn't luck," Julian said, more firmly this time. "I've reviewed her work line by line." A muffled sigh crackled through the phone. "Then what do you propose we do?" He thought of the contracts teetering on the edge of default, the board's warning emails piling up in his inbox. And then he thought of the clarity in Elise's eyes when she'd explained the flaw that had stumped everyone else. "I want her in on the recovery effort," he said. Marcus sputtered. "She's not even an employee." "Then we'll make her one." Elise's head lifted, startled. She hadn't expected him to say it out loud, not yet. "I'll call a meeting in an hour," Julian said, ending the call without waiting for further protest. He tucked the phone into his pocket and turned to face her fully. "You don't have to stay," he told her gently. "I know this is not what you signed up for." Elise's gaze darted from his face to the towering monitors still lit with reams of code. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Julian chose his words with care. "I want you to consult for us, at least until this crisis is resolved." She blinked. "But I'm not." "You are," he interrupted. "You're exactly who we need right now." For a moment, she looked as if she might refuse. Then she squared her shoulders, something resolute sparking behind the uncertainty. "What about the rest of your team?" she asked quietly. "They won't like this." He exhaled a short laugh, wry and tired. "They don't have to like it. They just have to watch you prove you're the best chance we have." He walked back to the desk, picked up the sheaf of contracts awaiting signatures. The final invoices from consultants who hadn't delivered a solution. All that wasted time and money. Elise drew in a careful breath. "If I agree, what happens next?" Julian met her eyes and spoke without hesitation. "Next," he said, "you walk into the boardroom, and you show them exactly what you showed me last night." Her mouth parted in surprise. "The board. They need to understand why I'm making this decision," he said. "And they need to hear it from you." "I've never presented to executives," she admitted. "Not even in school." "Then you'll start today." Elise glanced down at her hands, fidgeting with the hem of her borrowed sleeve. "I don't have a degree," she whispered. "You have something better," Julian said softly. "Proof you can do what no one else here could." The words seemed to sink into her, slowly dissolving her reluctance. She lifted her chin, met his gaze without flinching. "All right," she said at last. "I'll try." Julian felt a tightness ease in his chest. He hadn't realized until that moment how desperately he'd needed her to say yes. "Thank you," he said simply. They spent the next hour reviewing her work in detail. She explained her process, how she had recognized the subtle error in the data handlers, how she'd corrected it without breaking the interdependencies the other teams had feared touching. More than once, Julian had to remind himself she'd once been just a name on the cleaning rota. Now, she spoke like someone born to rebuild broken systems. When it was time to head downstairs, Elise hesitated at the doorway. She turned to look back at the penthouse, as though she were leaving behind a version of herself she would never quite return to. Julian watched her, feeling the strange certainty that the next few hours would not just save his company but redefine everything he thought he knew about talent and about second chances. He gestured for her to follow. "Come on," he said quietly. "Let's show them what you can do." And side by side, they stepped into the elevator, the doors sliding shut behind them with a hush that felt, for once, full of possibility. The elevator doors whispered open onto the 39th floor, revealing a stark white corridor lined with glass panels etched with the Caldwell Dynamics insignia. Sunlight gleamed across polished floors, catching every anxious footstep as Julian and Elise approached the boardroom. Inside, 12 men and women sat in tall leather chairs around a table that gleamed like obsidian. Laptops were already open, documents stacked in careful rows, evidence of the late-night scramble to prepare for this meeting. The room felt both cavernous and stifling, as though all the oxygen had been drained out before they arrived. Julian paused a moment just beyond the threshold. He could feel Elise hesitate behind him. He turned, studying her face. "Remember," he murmured, voice pitched low so only she could hear. "They don't have to believe in you yet. They just need to see the results." She nodded, though her eyes betrayed how close she was to bolting. He understood. Anyone would have been terrified. He stepped forward, and all heads turned. A hush fell over the table. The chairman, Leonard Phelps, cleared his throat. "Julian," he said in a tone that held both relief and irritation, "I assume you have an explanation for this unorthodox solution you've proposed?" "Yes," Julian replied. He gestured to Elise. "I'd like you all to meet Elise Marlowe." Several pairs of brows lifted in disbelief. Leonard adjusted his glasses, blinking as though Julian had produced a stray intern off the street. "And she is the reason we aren't already facing a $200 million write-off," Julian said evenly. A ripple of incredulous murmuring passed around the table. Elise swallowed and shifted her weight, as though she wanted to vanish. Julian felt a surge of protectiveness but forced himself to stay silent. She needed to speak for herself now. Leonard leaned back, folding his hands over his stomach. "Miss Marlowe," he said in a voice that suggested he doubted she could spell algorithm, "would you care to elaborate?" Elise opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Her gaze flicked to Julian. He gave her the smallest nod. And something in her shoulders straightened. "I was working in Mr. Hart's residence last night," she began, her voice steadying by degrees. "I saw the live debug monitor on his workstation. I noticed a repeated cascade failure in the data validation layer. Leonard raised a hand. "Forgive me, how did you recognize the code structure? You're not with our development team." "I'm not," she admitted. "I studied computer science at MIT. I didn't finish my degree because of a family emergency." Someone at the far end of the table made a skeptical noise, but Elise didn't flinch this time. "I recognized the error pattern because I built something similar as a personal project during my studies," she continued. "It was a recursive handler. The error logs indicated the failure began at precisely the same node every time. Your engineers were correcting the output but not the core function." She glanced at Julian. He watched her with quiet, fierce pride. "I rewrote the handler from scratch," she finished. "I tested it locally, then re-ran the simulation. The error didn't recur." The room fell utterly silent. Marcus Bell, who had joined by video call, cleared his throat from the big display on the wall. "She's right," he said, his voice gruff but tinged with reluctant respect. "I've reviewed her work personally. It's clean. It's better than anything we've attempted." Leonard steepled his fingers. "Extraordinary," he said, though it was unclear if he meant her skill or Julian's audacity in bringing her here. He turned to Julian. "You propose to retain her services?" "I do," Julian said. "As a consultant, at least until the launch is stabilized." "And you expect us to trust a Maid," Leonard said delicately, "with proprietary code that could affect billions in assets." Elise's chin lifted. "With respect, sir," she said, voice clear now, "you already have." The board erupted in overlapping protests. Julian let them talk for a full minute before he raised his hand. The room quieted, if only because they knew he rarely interrupted. "You all know I don't gamble with this company," Julian said. "I've spent my life here. You've watched me build it. You've watched me save it more than once. So when I say she's the reason we are not already ruined, you can believe it or not. But the results are there." He turned to Elise. "Show them." She stepped forward, sliding a flash drive into the main console. The enormous wall screen came to life, projecting her logs. As she walked them through the before and after benchmarks, her voice grew stronger. By the time she finished, even the most skeptical faces had softened with reluctant awe. Leonard's gaze flicked between her and Julian. "This is unprecedented." "It is," Julian agreed. "And it's exactly what we need." Silence fell again. Then Marcus spoke through the speaker. I support retaining her. She's already demonstrated more insight in one night than some of our highest-paid consultants. A murmur of reluctant assent went around the table. Leonard sighed. Very well, he said finally. Miss Marlowe will be granted provisional access under my oversight. But understand. I do, Elise said before he could finish. I won't let you down. Julian looked at her, and for a moment, he felt something shift, like a storm passing and leaving a clear sky behind. Leonard gave a curt nod. We reconvene in 48 hours. You have until then to ensure this solution holds. The meeting adjourned. As the others filed out, Julian turned to Elise. You were extraordinary, he said quietly. Her eyes glistened. I was terrified. That's what makes it more remarkable. She hesitated, then managed a tentative smile. Thank you for believing me. Julian felt something unspoken pass between them, a fragile new trust neither of them had expected. Come on, he said softly. Let's get back to work. And together, they stepped out of the boardroom, into a future neither had dared imagine. The office lights glowed long after midnight, a beacon above the sleeping city. On the 39th floor, a hush had settled, so profound it made every keystroke sound like thunder. The desks were littered with empty coffee cups and wrinkled drafts of code. Julian Hart had never allowed anyone but senior engineers in the main server room, but tonight was an exception. Tonight, Elise Marlowe sat at the console, the glow of 3 monitors reflecting in her steady eyes. She hadn't left this chair since the board meeting ended. Outside the glass wall, Julian watched her work. He should have been exhausted. He hadn't slept in 2 days, but watching her made something in him settle. For the first time in weeks, there was the smallest glimmer of hope that they would actually make it. Elise didn't flinch as lines of code streamed past. Her fingers flew over the keys, making adjustments in real time. She was rewriting entire modules, replacing outdated logic, reindexing calls, stripping away the bloated legacy code that had made the system so fragile. You're sure about that commit? Julian asked, stepping into the room at last. His voice was low, careful not to startle her. She didn't look away from the screen. Positive. The redundancy layers were conflicting. That's why the validation kept timing out. He moved closer, bracing a hand on the back of her chair. How did you even spot that? No one else did. I built something similar at MIT, she murmured, her tone almost shy. It never went into production, but I remember what it looked like when it failed. Julian watched the cursor blink as she typed. It struck him again how surreal this was. 2 days ago, she'd been cleaning the kitchen. Now she was rewriting the architecture of a $200 million project like it was second nature. Take a break, he said gently. I can't, Elise replied, her voice almost apologetic. If I stop now, I'll lose track of what I've tested. He opened his mouth to insist, then closed it. She was right. And she was still calm, focused in a way that made his respect for her deepen every hour. Instead, he walked to the cabinet in the corner and poured a fresh cup of coffee, placing it beside her elbow. She gave him the tiniest smile of thanks before returning her gaze to the monitor. Julian, she said after a long silence. Yes. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. What happens when this is over? He wasn't sure how to answer. For a moment, he looked past her, out to the city where thousands of people were asleep in their beds, unaware of how close Caldwell Dynamics had come to catastrophe. Depends, he said at last. If you finish this, if it works, everything changes. Her throat bobbed in a swallow. And if it doesn't? Then the company collapses. And everything we've built ends. She took a slow, measured breath. Then I won't fail. The quiet conviction in her voice made something tighten in his chest. A chime sounded, a security ping from the backup servers. Elise leaned forward, scanning the logs. A line of red text blinked at the bottom of the screen. Another error? Julian asked. She shook her head. No. This is good. It means the first module passed validation. He exhaled in relief. One module down. For more to go. Elise stretched her neck, rolling her shoulders. Her hair had fallen out of its clip, a tangle of blonde waves framing her face. Julian had a sudden, absurd impulse to brush it back for her, but he clenched his hand instead. Can I ask you something? She said softly. Anything. Why did you trust me? The question caught him off guard. He thought back to that night, when he'd found her at his desk, typing with a kind of desperate focus he'd never seen. Because you weren't trying to impress anyone, he said honestly. You were trying to help. Her lips parted, but no words came. After a moment, she looked back at the screen. The hours bled together. Julian made calls to the satellite offices, fielded messages from the board, answered investors' frantic questions, all while Elise kept working. The clock above the door crept toward 4 a.m. At last, she pushed back from the desk, eyes glassy with exhaustion. "That's it," she whispered. "All modules." "Yes." She turned to face him fully. "If the final tests pass, the system will be fully stable." He swallowed hard. "Run them." Elise nodded and tapped the key. On the main display, a progress bar filled in agonizing increments. They stood shoulder to shoulder, watching the seconds crawl by. Neither of them spoke. At last, a single word flashed in green text across the center of the screen. "Validated." Julian closed his eyes. For a moment, all he could do was breathe. When he looked at Elise again, she was blinking back tears. "You did it," he said, voice rough. "We did it," she corrected softly. The world beyond the glass walls was still dark, but inside, a new dawn had already begun. Morning broke over the skyline in a soft haze of gold and pale blue. By 7, the top floor of Caldwell Dynamics was already humming with anxious energy. A line of sleek black cars pulled up to the private elevator, and one by one, the board members stepped out, their faces drawn and serious. Inside the glass-walled boardroom, the tension was thick enough to taste. Every seat was filled. Executives whispered to one another, their eyes flicking to the empty chair at the head of the table, Julian's chair. They all knew why they were here. To decide whether Caldwell Dynamics would survive or collapse. A large screen on the far wall glowed with last night's test results. Lines of green check marks replaced the red failures that had haunted them for weeks. But many in the room didn't yet trust what they saw. Finally, the door opened. Julian Hart walked in, looking as though he'd aged a decade in a day. Beside him, Elise Marlowe followed quietly, her hair pulled into a tidy twist, her face pale but composed. The executives turned to stare, some in confusion, some in outright skepticism. Julian didn't waste time. He set his tablet on the polished wood, cleared his throat, and began. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, voice steady though exhaustion lined his features. "Last night, the system passed full validation for the first time since this crisis began." A low murmur rippled through the room. One of the board members, a silver-haired man named Crawford, raised an eyebrow. "And we're to believe that happened overnight? After 3 weeks of failure?" Julian's gaze didn't waver. "Yes. And who exactly performed this miracle?" Crawford pressed, his tone edged with disbelief. Julian gestured to Elise. "Ms. Marlowe." Heads turned again, assessing her as if she were some curiosity behind glass. Elise lifted her chin, though her heart thumped painfully. "She's the maid, isn't she?" another executive demanded. "The one you hired 2 weeks ago?" "She was," Julian said simply. "But she also happens to be a former MIT candidate with a specialty in advanced systems architecture." The boardroom erupted, voices layered over one another in incredulous disbelief. Elise stood still under their scrutiny, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. "You expect us to believe she fixed what entire divisions could not?" Crawford's tone was sharp, condescending. "With all respect, Julian, this is either desperation or a joke." Julian held up a hand, silencing the protests. "I reviewed every line of her work myself. I also brought in 2 independent auditors to confirm it. The solution was real and effective." He tapped the tablet, switching to a live demonstration. On the big screen, the company's flagship system hummed in real time. No glitches, no error codes. Clean, stable, operational. Ms. Marlowe rebuilt the indexing and replaced the recursive calls that were overloading the server. She also discovered a vulnerability that could have cost us everything in a few weeks. The silence that followed was deafening. Elise looked at her hands, fighting the impulse to fold into herself. But then she felt Julian's hand rest lightly at her back. Just that simple gesture steadied her. Crawford cleared his throat. "I see." His eyes narrowed slightly. "And what do you propose, Julian? That we retain her?" "As what? A janitor with benefits?" Julian's jaw flexed. "As the new director of systems engineering." A collective gasp circled the table. "You can't be serious," someone whispered. "I'm entirely serious," Julian said, voice low but firm. "She's the only reason you're sitting here with a solvent company." Several board members looked at each other, calculating the optics, the politics, the risk. But even the skeptics couldn't deny the proof on the screen. Crawford folded his arms, leaning back. "You'll need to put this to a vote." "Fine." Julian turned to Elise. "Will you step outside for a moment?" She nodded, feeling her legs tremble as she walked out into the corridor. The door clicked shut behind her. She stood staring at her reflection in the polished elevator doors, her pulse drumming in her ears. Inside, the voices rose and fell, muffled but intense. She tried not to imagine what they were saying, tried not to wonder if all of this was about to vanish as quickly as it had come. After what felt like hours, the door opened again. Julian stepped out, his expression unreadable. "Elise," he said quietly. "They've agreed." Her breath caught. "They have?" He nodded, something almost like a smile in his tired eyes. "Effective immediately, you're joining the leadership team." Her hand flew to her mouth, tears stinging. "You earned this," he said, voice gentler now. "All of it." She laughed shakily. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll stay," Julian replied, and there was something raw in his voice that had nothing to do with business. She swallowed hard and met his gaze. "I'll stay." And in that moment, with the sun rising behind the glass towers, Elise felt, for the first time in years, like her life was truly beginning again. Elise Marlowe never imagined she would step into an executive office wearing her old gray coat, clutching a paper cup of coffee as though it were an anchor. Just 48 hours before, she had been cleaning this same floor in the dark. Now, the gold-embossed plaque on the glass door read, Director of Systems Engineering. Her heart thudded unevenly as she turned the handle. The office was sleek, all black leather and brushed steel. Floor-to-ceiling windows bathed everything in morning light, revealing a skyline she used to admire only from a distance. She set her coffee on the desk and tried to steady her breathing. A folder waited there, stamped with urgent red tabs, her first official briefing. She sank into the chair, fingertips brushing the edge of the executive keyboard. It felt surreal, like she was borrowing someone else's life. A knock at the open door startled her. She looked up to find Julian standing there, fresh from an early board call. He wore the same navy suit as the day before, his tie loosened just enough to show fatigue. Yet something in his expression softened when he saw her. "You're early," he said, stepping inside. "I couldn't sleep," Elise admitted. "I thought it would feel more real if I just started." Julian nodded and walked to the window, gazing down at the river snaking through the city. "It's going to feel strange for a while. You went from invisible to indispensable overnight. That doesn't happen without ripples." "I know," she whispered, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I'm not sure anyone here wants me in this chair." Julian turned, leaning back against the windowsill. "You earned that chair. They'll see it soon enough." Elise swallowed, studying his face. "Why did you really give me this job?" "Because," he said after a moment, "you did what none of us could. And because you remind me of what I used to be." She blinked, unsure how to respond. Before she could, Julian straightened and motioned to the file. "There's something in there you need to see." Two somethings, actually. Her pulse picked up as she flipped open the folder. The first document was an internal memo marked confidential. It outlined a timeline of system failures stretching back 6 months, long before anyone admitted there was a problem. "This isn't possible," Elise murmured, scanning the dates. "They knew the platform was unstable?" "Some of them did," Julian said grimly. "They thought it was safer to hide the instability than delay the launch. If you hadn't stepped in when you did, the servers would have failed catastrophically within weeks." She looked up, her voice thin. "So you didn't just give me this job because I fixed the code?" "No," his jaw tightened. "I need you to help me rebuild it the right way. Transparent. Secure. No more backroom compromises." She turned the page and found the second document, a list of department heads and project managers who had signed off on the concealment. Some names she recognized from the board meeting. Others she didn't. But they all shared one thing, power. Her stomach twisted. "This will blow up everything." "Yes," Julian said quietly. "But it's the only way the company survives in the long run. We have to start clean." Elise closed the folder and exhaled, the weight of her new reality pressing down. "And if they fight us?" Julian's eyes met hers across the polished desk. "Then we fight back." He reached for the phone on her desk and handed it to her. "I want you to call a meeting for this afternoon. All the engineering leads, all the operations heads. Tell them you'll be presenting a full system audit." Her fingers curled around the handset. "They won't take me seriously." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Make them." Elise nodded, feeling something ignite low in her chest. Fear, yes, but also determination. She had crawled out of too many shadows to shrink from this. When Julian left, she sat there alone for a moment, the silence somehow comforting. She thought about her mother, about the nights she had watched her scrub other people's kitchens just to keep them alive, About the hours Elise spent studying algorithms in the corner of a crowded shelter. She had always promised herself she would find a way back to the life she'd nearly earned. Now she had. But she hadn't expected to inherit the responsibility of tearing down the corruption rotting it from the inside. Carefully, she picked up the phone and dialed the internal line. "This is Elise Marlowe," she said when the operator answered. Her voice was clear, strong. "Please schedule a mandatory meeting at 3 p.m. today. All department leads. No exceptions." "Yes, ma'am," the operator replied, with the faintest note of surprise. When she hung up, Elise allowed herself a single deep breath. Then she pulled up the system logs on her monitor and began reviewing the code that had nearly cost the company everything. By the time the sun rose higher over the city, she no longer felt like an imposter in her own office. She was ready for the fight. The tension in the main conference room was thicker than the glass walls enclosing it. Elise sat at the head of the table she had once polished with a rag, a screen behind her displaying lines of exposed code and transaction records. Around her, every department head and senior executive waited in brittle silence, their eyes shifting between her and Julian Cross. She could feel every flicker of skepticism, every silent accusation. But this time, she wasn't afraid of them. She had earned her place here. Julian stood at her side, arms crossed. He didn't say a word as Elise began. "I know many of you don't agree with this audit," she said, her voice steady. "But it was necessary. Over the past 6 months, system integrity was knowingly compromised to avoid delays and protect quarterly numbers." Murmurs rippled down the table. Elise pressed a key, bringing up a chart that showed the cumulative damage, the billions in potential liability, the unfulfilled contracts, the reputation hanging by a thread. "When I first came here, I was hired to clean floors," she continued, her gaze sweeping the room. "I watched this company from the outside. I saw what it meant to people, employees, clients, the public. And I saw how fragile it was because no one was willing to speak the truth." A voice cut across the hush, sharp and defensive. "You think you can come in here and lecture us on truth? You're a maid who got lucky." Elise turned her gaze to the director of operations, who leaned back in his chair with a sneer. "No," she said calmly. "I'm the person who fixed the failure no one else could. And the person who will make sure it never happens again." She pressed another key, revealing the signatures of those who had approved the concealment. A collective intake of breath followed. "These documents prove that the code was deliberately altered and the reports were falsified," she went on. "From this moment forward, the chain of command is suspended. All divisions will report to me and Mr. Cross until a new oversight protocol is in place." "That's outrageous," someone barked. "You have no authority." Julian finally stepped forward. His voice was quiet but carried like a blade. "She does now. As of this morning, the board ratified Elise Marlowe as interim CTO and Director of Systems Integrity. Anyone who refuses her directive is free to resign immediately." The silence was absolute. Elise felt her heart beating so hard it nearly drowned out the hum of the projector. "But you have a choice," she said, her voice gentler now. "You can help rebuild this company into something stronger than it was before. Or you can walk out that door and watch it collapse." A long moment passed. Then the chief of cybersecurity cleared his throat. "Where do we start?" Elise looked at him, and for the first time since she'd stepped into this world of polished shoes and expensive suits, she felt like she belonged. "We start by restoring every compromised line of code," she said. "Then we contact our largest clients with a full disclosure. We'll show them that transparency matters more than protecting our pride." The faces around the table were changing, skepticism giving way to a reluctant respect. Julian rested a hand on her shoulder. "I'll handle the board," he murmured. "You handle the systems." And she did. Over the next week, Elise worked 16-hour days, side by side with the same engineers who had once ignored her existence. She taught them her process, how she'd spotted the flaw, why she'd recognized the signature of a deliberate corruption. Slowly, something extraordinary began to happen. The platform stabilized. Contracts that had been suspended were reactivated. A cautious optimism trickled through every department. At the end of the week, Elise finally allowed herself to return to her tiny apartment, just for a single night of real sleep. She stood in the kitchen, her mother's photograph propped on the counter, and tried to process the impossible truth. She wasn't cleaning other people's dreams anymore. She was building her own. The next morning, when she arrived at Caldwell Tower, the lobby security guard gave her a solemn nod. Executives in the elevator greeted her by name. No one looked past her. When she walked into her office, there was a single envelope on her desk. Inside was a letter embossed with the Caldwell Dynamics seal. Elise Marlowe, Chief Technology Officer. She traced the letters with her fingertips, feeling the reality of it anchor her in place. At precisely 9 a.m., Julian knocked and stepped in. He looked different, lighter, somehow. "You did it," he said simply. "We did it," Elise corrected, and a small smile curved her lips. He glanced around her new office. "How does it feel?" "Terrifying," she admitted. "And wonderful." Julian nodded. "That's how you know it's worth it." He turned to leave, pausing at the doorway. "I'll be in the boardroom if you need me." Elise watched him go, then looked around the office that was finally hers. She thought about everything it had taken to get here, the long nights scrubbing floors, the loss, the doubts, the single moment she'd decided to take a risk and trust herself. That decision had changed everything. With a deep breath, she sat down at her desk and opened the morning reports. There was still so much to do, but for the first time, she felt ready. If you found this story inspiring, make sure to subscribe to Zyman Stories, where we bring you incredible true tales of resilience, transformation, and the power of believing in your own potential. Because sometimes, the person no one notices is exactly the one the world needs most.